Hello, my name is Dr. Hannah Lindsay, and I'm a research associate in the Traumatic Brain Injury and Concussion Center at the University of Utah. Although my work is more in the field of cognitive neuroscience these days, I have over a decade of experience in neuropsych testing in clinical, forensic, and research settings. And in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the neuropsychology of decision making, which is a higher order cognitive process that humans and non-human animals share, as it is a very important function of survival. And although decision making can kind of be thought of as its own specific function, there is also a lot of overlap with other executive functions, particularly inhibition, planning, and cognitive control, which you have or will learn about in other ENIGMA-U lectures. So it is estimated that the average adult makes about 35,000 conscious decisions each day. Assuming that most people spend around 7 hours a day sleeping, that makes roughly 2,000 decisions per hour, or one every 2 seconds. This includes every small choice from deciding when to wake up, what to eat, what clothes to wear, to more complex decisions at work or in your personal life, like which job offer to accept or if you're ready to start a family. Shoppers at the mall, judges in the courtroom, voters in the polling booth, we are all faced with the same fundamental challenge of making optimal choices in complex and changing environments that have varying benefits and costs, risks and opportunities, and levels of uncertainty. Decision making is at the core of flexible, goal-oriented behavior. And the actual process of coming to a decision is extremely complex, but at the most basic level, it is the process of choosing between options on the basis of their subjective value. Value plays a central role in practically every aspect of human life that requires a decision. Which consumer goods to choose, which person we want to marry, what we decide to do in our free time. All of that comes down to what option has the most value to us. Value reflects the importance that something holds for us. What doesn't have any value is of no interest. Values can be conceptualized in different ways, and different fields focus on different aspects of what value is. Neuroeconomic models of decision-making conceptualize value as a measure of the benefit or reward that will be gained from choosing an option. Cornerstone idea here is that before you make any decision, we first compute the value or reward associated with each option, and then compare the different values in some way. So in this framework, decision-making is all about making choices that maximize value or reward. Many decision models like this that are simply based on mathematical and economic principles are built solely on the idea of logic and of a cost-benefit analysis. And although they're pretty good at predicting how people should act, they often fail to describe how people actually act. So it's clear that they don't take into account some important aspect of decision-making. A leading idea in cognitive neuroscience is the somatic marker hypothesis, which states that emotion-related signals, or somatic markers, can bias certain choices, either consciously or unconsciously. So in other words, emotion leads people to make suboptimal and sometimes irrational decisions. This idea comes from lesion studies, where many of the participants with brain damage who had difficulty making decisions also suffered from flattened emotions and an inability to respond to emotional events. Basically, emotions bias certain choices by influencing subjective value. In fact, the subjective value associated with any one option is influenced by a multitude of internal and external factors that can vary greatly depending on the context of the decision, the individual making the decision, the environment you're in, the social consequences of the choices, and many other things. Understanding how the brain computes value and processes rewards, and how the interplay of all of these internal and external factors influences those processes, is crucial for comprehending how decisions are made and what parts of the brain are involved. So value-based decision-making can be broken down into 5 basic processes: representation, valuation, action selection, outcome evaluation, and learning. These stages may be highly interlinked and are likely to have bidirectional influence on each other. They're also flexible. For example, valuation doesn't always occur before action selection. Sometimes you act before you think, in other words. So first, we construct a representation of the decision problem, which plays an essential part in the decision-making by identifying the potential courses of action that need to be evaluated, as well as identifying the internal and external states that inform those valuations. So some examples of those kinds of internal and external factors are shown on the right. There's a lot more than just these. These are just some of the big ones. In the second process, valuation, the different actions that are under consideration need to be assigned a value. Here, the values of the options are determined by a weighted combination of these kinds of internal and external sources of information. And external factors can be things like, will I get the reward right away? How certain am I that I will actually get the reward? How will my choice affect the people around me? Internal factors are things like, am I feeling motivated? Am I willing to wait for the reward? Was I happy when I chose this specific thing in the past? Other factors can unconsciously affect valuation, like cognitive ability, for example. So, someone with ADHD might have impulsivity issues, or somebody with Asperger's might not be able to understand how their decision will affect other people. In order to make appropriate decisions, the values assigned have to be reliable predictors of the benefits that are likely to result from each action. Decisions can be goal-oriented or habitual. Goal-oriented decisions are based on the assessment of the expected reward, whereas habits, by definition, are actions that are no longer under the control of reward. So we just execute them simply because the context triggers the action. In the third step of this process, action selection, the different values are compared so that the person can select a choice or action. Fourth, after implementing the action, the brain evaluates the desirability of the outcomes. And finally, learning occurs, where feedback measures are used to update the other processes to improve the quality of future decision. And that part's really important to decision making. All right, so before diving into the specific neuroanatomy underlying that value-based decision-making process I just went over, I want to review some basic frontal lobe anatomy and go over some of the functions of the different subregions broadly, particularly as they relate to decision-making processes. But first, it's important to understand how to navigate the brain. And you may have seen something like this before, but in case you haven't, I thought it might be helpful. So we tend to refer to areas of the brain by the relative positions an area is relative to other parts of the brain. So for example, anything closer to the right or left outside of the brain, in this left image here, anything closer to the outside is considered more lateral than anything closer to the middle of the brain. And anything closer to the middle is considered more medial than anything towards the outside edges of the brain. When something is closer to the front of the brain, so if we look on this picture on the right, anything closer to the fronter is more anterior or rostral to everything behind it. And when something is closer to the back, it's more posterior or caudal to everything in front of it. And when an area we're thinking of is closer to the top of the brain, it's considered more superior or dorsal to everything below it. And when it's closer to the bottom, it's considered relatively more inferior or ventral to everything above it. And the specific terms like rostral versus anterior or dorsal versus superior, those are, they kind of vary by discipline, but they're used interchangeably. All right, so here's some anatomy. Everything highlighted here is part of the frontal lobe, and everything anterior to or in front of the orange motor cortex right here is considered to be part of the prefrontal cortex, so all of this. And this is the part we're really interested in when it comes to higher order cognitive processes like decision making and other executive functions. The prefrontal cortex, or PFC, can basically be divided into lateral and medial parts. And from each view, so here's lateral, here's medial, the prefrontal cortex is further divided into dorsal or upper and ventral or lower parts. In addition to that, the most anterior part is the frontal pole, which is here in red. And the most ventral part is called the orbital frontal cortex, which is here, green and yellow. So as you can see on the lateral view of the brain, we have the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex here, ventrolateral prefrontal region here, and we have the frontal pole, and then the lateral orbital frontal cortex at the very bottom. On the medial slice, we have the dorsomedial prefrontal, and then the ventromedial prefrontal regions in the purple and dark purple, frontal pole again, and then we have medial orbital frontal cortex. And then we also have this dark green region, which is the anterior cingulate cortex, which kind of wraps around the corpus callosum, which is this right here. Okay, and then if we look here at this ventral view, or at the inferior part of the brain, the bottom, then we can get a better view of the orbital frontal cortex here. And you can see how it's broadly divided into lateral and medial parts. So the prefrontal cortex is believed to house two distinct functional networks that are broadly concerned with control and motivation as they pertain to adaptive behavior. And they can be thought of as the cognitive control and value-based decision-making networks. The cognitive control network is associated more with a larger part of the anterior cingulate and more dorsal and lateral parts of the prefrontal cortex. And it draws from multiple executive functions that work together to maintain goals by adjusting attention and working memory flexibly and using these resources to change to environments and different task demands. But that's the cognitive control system. So in contrast to that, the value-based decision-making network is mainly associated with the more ventral and medial parts of the prefrontal cortex. So this area here, particularly the orbital frontal cortex down here. And this network is concerned with evaluating incoming stimuli and computing their expected future reward to guide choices. In other words, the medial orbital frontal cortex plays a very key role in the representation of value. It also is primarily responsible for learning through feedback, particularly under conditions that require flexible responding. And it has a very important role in social cognition, such as emotion recognition and theory of mind, which is like understanding that somebody else has their own subconscious and thoughts and emotions and view of the world. The best way to appreciate the role of the orbital frontal cortex in decision making is to understand how it's connected with other parts of the brain that are involved in processing sensory, emotional, motivational, and reward information. The OFC, or orbital frontal cortex, has a diverse pattern of connectivity which reflects its wide range of functions and suggests its role in the integration of all kinds of incoming information about one's internal and external environment. It is unique in some important ways when compared to the rest of the prefrontal cortex. So the OFC is the only part of the frontal cortex that receives information from all 5 sensory modalities, and it has particularly strong connections with the piriform cortex, which is involved in processing smells, as well as the insular cortex, which kind of hides inside the area where the frontal and temporal lobes meet. It's shown in dark purple in that small brain on the right. And it's involved in taste processing as well as touch processing, amongst other things. Unlike the rest of the prefrontal cortex, the OFC has weak connections to motor areas. So instead of influencing motor behavior, it influences behavior through its very strong connections with the nucleus accumbens or ventral striatum. And this is the brain's reward center. And that's a really important aspect to this whole decision-making process here. The OFC is also extensively connected with limbic system structures, including the amygdala and hippocampus, which have really important roles in emotion memory, as well as the anterior cingulate cortex, which is also part of the limbic system, and it's involved in the monitoring of one's own actions and their outcomes, and in detecting conflicts or other shifts in environmental contingencies and adapting ongoing behavior accordingly. The OFC also has influence over motivation and autonomic nervous system through its connections with the hypothalamus and other brainstem structures. So basically, the connections of the OFC are compatible with structures that integrate sensory and reward information. Overall, the connections of the OFC suggests that it integrates multiple sensory properties with effective and motivational information. And as this information enters the OFC, it's used to calculate the value of the outcome and determine how rewarding it is. This process involves assessing trade-offs, determining how well the outcome satisfies current needs, and comparing the outcome with other potential reward outcomes. The OFC then sends this information about the value of a reward to the lateral prefrontal cortex, those areas involved in cognitive control, where the information is used to construct behavioral plans, prioritize goals, and generate expected future outcomes. And in turn, the more medial prefrontal areas involved in value-based decision-making can use the information about the value of the outcome and the behavioral plan to determine whether the action is actually worth performing. All of these calculations take place in working memory, so there is an ongoing pattern of neuronal activity in each of these areas during these processes. All right, so an impairment in decision making reflects the specific functions of the orbital frontal cortex and its connections we just talked about. These include an inability to assess risk, difficulty adapting to changing environments, trouble thinking about the future, weighing decisions too much on emotion, and difficulty integrating internal and external information. And we see these symptoms in a lot of psychological and neurological conditions, including healthy aging. And impaired decision making even predicts an increased mortality rate. So that really highlights the importance of decision-making abilities in real life. Furthermore, component behaviors related to decision-making, like impulsivity and apathy, are prominent across a lot of clinical settings and really reflect how frequently decision-making is affected in mental illness across the board. A better understanding of the neuropsychological basis of decision-making has widespread potential applications to neurological and psychiatric conditions such as these, as well as to maladaptive variations in behavior within the normal range of functioning. And this has implications for public health, ethics, and the law. So understanding these processes is really important. A major challenge in neuropsychological assessment is to measure decision-making in a laboratory or clinic in a way that reliably and validly captures the type of decision-making demands that individuals tend to confront in the real world and everyday settings. So how do we test for it? In the same way that decision-making has its own neurobiological underpinnings that are kind of separate from the rest of the prefrontal cortex, that supports the other executive functions, decision-making has its own unique way of being tested. As we've just discussed, it involves the integration of a lot of different things, and cognitive abilities, particularly executive function. Those definitely play a role in what kind of decisions someone's going to make. So earlier we talked about the two distinct prefrontal pathways, the dorsolateral and cognitive control versus the ventromedial and valuation. There are a ton of neuropsych assessments that measure things related to that control pathway. So things like response inhibition, cognitive flexibility, planning, working memories, all of those processes that occur more in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But measuring the specific components related to value-based decision-making are a bit trickier, and it relies on the studies that look at neuropsychological performance in patients with damage to the orbital frontal cortex specifically. And these lesion studies have reliably shown that people with orbital frontal cortex damage perform poorly on tasks that target decision-making processes specifically, while their frontal lobe functions like cognitive control tend to remain unaffected. So they do well on most other measures of executive function. It's just those ones that target the value-based decision-making that they do poorly on. So we'll talk about those now. All right, so the first one is the Iowa gambling task. And this is the most commonly used measure of decision-making in literature. The Iowa gambling task, or IGT, is a neuropsych test that was designed to simulate real-life decision-making, and it's used to assess an individual's ability to make profitable decisions. Its real-world applicability make it a valuable tool for assessing how individuals might make decisions in everyday life, especially under conditions of uncertainty. It's been instrumental in the study of the somatic marker hypothesis, which again is the idea that emotional processes influence decision-making and other behavior. And in fact, it was specifically developed to measure decision-making impairments in patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and orbital frontal cortex due to their involvement in emotional regulation and risk-reward assessment. So how it works is a patient is presented with 4 virtual card decks on a computer screen, and they're given a loan of $2,000 in play money, so it's not real money. The patient is then asked to select cards from the 4 decks, A, B, C, and D, and each card selection will result in winning some money, but occasionally each card also results in losing some money. And the patients are instructed to try to win as much money as possible and avoid losing as much money as possible. They can switch between decks at any time, as often as they wish. They're just basically told that some decks are worse than others, and even if they find all of them bad, some are worse. So no matter how much you find yourself losing, you can still win as long as you stay away from the worst decks. What they don't know is that 2 of the decks, usually A and B, are disadvantageous and yield high immediate gains, but larger losses in the long run. While the other 2 decks, C and D, are advantageous. They offer smaller immediate gains, but also incur lower losses. So overall, they lead to a greater profit than the other decks. And participants must decide which decks are advantageous and which are not based on the rewards and penalties they receive as they go. So they basically have to figure it out by trying them out, and they have to factor together uncertainty and reward and punishment. And by doing this, the IGT explicitly creates a conflict between that lure of immediate reward versus the delayed probabilistic punishment. Choices have to be made on the basis of a hunch or a gut feeling. And in many choices, there is risk and uncertainty, no guarantee of the outcome, and it's just like real life. The IGT also assesses temporal discounting, which basically is an individual's ability to forego immediate rewards for greater long-term gain. And this is a crucial aspect of risk assessment and decision making, and it's often impaired in people with orbital frontal cortex lesions. It also measures the participant's ability to control their impulses related to negative outcomes. And it is used to understand how individuals learn from feedback and how emotional processing influences decision making. So these lesion studies have shown reliably that the people are impaired on this task when they have focal brain lesions in the orbital frontal cortex, as well as the amygdala and the insula. Typically, these patients just don't learn to avoid the disadvantageous decks as the task goes on. So even if they discover and articulate the fact that decks A and B are resulting in high losses, they continue to drift back to those bad disadvantageous decks over trials and just end up losing large sums of money. And this happens consistently. Some studies have shown that this pattern performance even correlates strongly with real world deficits in social and interpersonal interactions. And in addition to those with the specific lesions in the OFC, poor performance on this task has also been demonstrated in individuals with diffuse traumatic brain injury, substance use disorders, Parkinson's disease, and other dementias, as well as psychiatric conditions like psychopathy, schizophrenia, and mood disorders, all the things that were listed on the previous slide about the kinds of conditions that suffer from impaired decision making. All right, and the next task is the intra-extra dimensional set shifting task, or IED, which is part of the CAN-TAB battery. This is a widely used tool. The battery is a widely used tool in cognitive and clinical neuroscience for assessing various aspects of cognitive function, but the IED is specifically designed to assess executive functions related to one's ability to adjust their thinking or attentional focus in response to changing rules or environments. And specifically, it measures rule acquisition, reversal learning, and attentional set shifting. And I'm going to try to explain this complicated task as efficiently as I can. So it's computer-based, and it involves presenting participants with colored shapes and white line contours that increase in complexity over 9 different levels as distractors are added and rules change. So patients are initially presented with 5 learning levels, which is like the 5 levels there that are on the right side of the cards on the slide. And in these levels, there's a series of multi-dimensional stimuli that are presented, and the patient must learn to respond selectively to a specific shape while ignoring the other shapes and lines. And in this first trial, they see 2 different shapes, and one of them is correct and the other one is not. And whichever one they choose, if it's the correct one, they're rewarded with like a visual cue. And if it's the incorrect one, they get no reward. And these learning levels are used to determine whether the participant is able to discriminate between stimuli and benefit from feedback or learning. So throughout the learning phases, these 5 initial levels, some minor rule changes occur where the second level involves a simple reversal of the correct stimuli. So the one that was correct, the first level is no longer correct. Instead, the other one is now the correct one. So just a reversal of which one was correct. Then in the 3rd and 4th stages, they get presented with compound stimuli where some contoured line appears either next to or on top of the shapes. And still where the same shape that was correct from the reversal stage is correct, regardless of the presence of the line in these levels. And then in the 5th level, there's another reversal of the correct stimuli again, so that the shape that was correct the first level is correct once again. And it's also presented with that line superimposed over it. So it's a compound reversal. Okay, so the next 4 levels, level 6 through 9, these are the really important ones. Level 6 is the intra-dimensional shift. That's where 2 new shapes are presented and they have lines with them. So the shapes and the lines are new, not the same as they were during the learning trials. But the patient needs to keep responding according to the shape dimension. So they're still trying to figure out which is the correct shape and ignoring that line. And now they're responding to a different shape than they had been presented with before. So they have 2 new shapes. Then level 7 consists of an intradimensional reversal, where the previously ignored shape from level 6 is now the correct target. And then after that is the extra dimensional shift at level 8, where the correct rule now changes to the lines instead of the shapes, and they have to focus on those lines as being correct rather than the shapes. And then the last level, level 9, is the extra dimensional reversal, where the participant must respond to the previously ignored line. So the extra dimensional shift is more demanding than the intradimensional shift because it requires a perceptual shift in addition to a shift from one dimension to another. So it requires a shifting cognitive set. And this part of the task is really sensitive to people with dorsolateral prefrontal lesions. So they tend to have difficulty on that extra dimensional shift, which makes sense because the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is important for cognitive control, which includes set shifting. What's interesting is that individuals with damage to the ventromedial areas, or the areas responsible for value-based decision making, tend to perform normally on the more difficult extra dimensional shift trials, but they have a lot of trouble with the intra-dimensional shift and with the reversal levels. So the primary difficulty these patients have is with the reversal learning component, meaning that they struggle to adapt to those changing environmental contingencies, which makes sense because if you remember from earlier in the lecture, learning from feedback is a huge part in the decision-making process. There are some other measures that are used to assess decision-making abilities, but this one and the IGT are definitely the most studied, and in my experience, the most commonly used clinically. All right, so here's some great papers if you want to read more about all of this. But that is all that I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you learned something.